Once again, we're just waiting a couple minutes before beginning, but this is the Moab Museum, and we're speaking with Chris Merritt this evening about Chinese railroad workers in Utah. Thirty more seconds. Welcome to everyone joining us on Facebook too. We'll just wait till 6:30 and kick it off. All right. Welcome everyone tuning in on Zoom and on Facebook Live to this online event from the Moab Museum. I am Mary Langworthy. I handle community outreach and events here at the Moab Museum. And this evening we're going to be hearing from Dr. Christopher Merritt, who will be speaking about the Chinese railroad worker experience in Utah as understood through both history and archaeology. This summer, the museum hosted a traveling exhibition all about the history of the Transcontinental Railroad in Utah and the predominantly Chinese laborers who built it. We are pleased to be able to offer this presentation with Dr. Merritt, who helped create the exhibit that we hosted this summer to continue our community's conversation about this chapter of history. Dr. Merritt received his PhD from the University of Montana in anthropology in 2010, focusing on the archaeological and historical investigations of the overseas Chinese. Before that, he received a Master of Science in Industrial Archaeology from Michigan Technological University, where he studied the trade and consumption of Mormon-produced pottery in Utah. Since 2004, Merritt has worked in a variety of professional archaeological settings, including the United States Forest Service in Utah and Nevada, private archaeological contracting in Salt Lake City, and finally as State Historic Preservation Officer for the Utah Division of State History. In addition to full-time employment with the state of Utah, he is an adjunct faculty at Salt Lake Community College, where he teaches courses on historical archaeology and cultural resource management. We are so grateful to have you here. Thank you so much for your time. Before I turn it over to Dr. Merritt, I would like to let you all know in the audience that you are welcomed and encouraged to ask questions in the chat in the Q&A feature in Zoom. I'll be monitoring those throughout the event, and we will have about 15 minutes at the end to relay audience questions. For folks joining us on Facebook, you are welcome to add comments in the comments below the live video. I'll relay those as well during the Q&A. As a reminder, this conversation will be found on Facebook after the fact, so it will be shareable there and available to be watched again. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you so much to the Moab Museum for hosting me tonight. I look forward to speaking to you all tonight. And about 4 years ago, I actually came down to Moab, did a presentation at the MIC on sort of the broader historical and archaeological picture of the Chinese here in Utah. And tonight, I'm going to highlight a little bit of that, but really dive into a project that has been a real passion for us in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management in the Chinese descendant community. So a little bit of hands-on archaeology, I think, is going to be fun. Switch the views. So thanks everybody for your patience. And as Mary said, I'm open to as many questions as you want to pepper with me today. So The site I'm going to talk about in depth tonight is called Terrace, Utah, and it's in almost as far northwestern part of the state of Utah as you can get. This is a really remote yet beautiful part of the state, same as you guys down in Moab, but with a lot different geology and a much different history. And so the site that we're going to talk about in depth is along the Transcontinental Railroad. So that was the big famous one finished May 10th of 1869, that it used about 3/4 of Chinese labor on the western end, from Sacramento, California, here into Promontory Summit, where the Golden Spike, if you know that story, was driven. About 13 to 15,000 Chinese workers at its peak worked for the Central Pacific. And then for the next 30 years, worked and maintained that same transcontinental railroad that they had built. And so what was really fun is after that May 10th, 1869 moment, the great Golden Spike event, the Chinese became the dominant maintenance railroad force from Sacramento to Omaha on our transcontinental railroad. But by the late 19th century, the anti-Chinese legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Gary Act of 1892 changed how railroads could get labor and from where. And so we see by the 1890s, most railroads in the United States switching to other types of labor, like Japanese, Greek, Italian. And so the Chinese story on the railroad after 1900 begins to diminish, but the impact they left behind is really staggering. And in partnership with the folks on this slide, the Bureau of Land Management and the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendant Association, we've been able to kind of research this history, bring it back to life, and do some really fun archaeological excavations. As Mary mentioned, I work for the Utah Division of State History, which is a branch of state government. My job as the SHPO or State Historic Preservation Officer, sorry, jargon kicking in already. My job is to manage archaeologists, architectural historians, and architects who help to organize and promote historic preservation statewide. And as an archaeologist, my passion is digging in the dirt. And so that's what we're going to highlight for you all tonight is this little story. And this is a group shot of a project that we did last year. We've done 2 years of excavation on the site. But I went ahead and entered in some ghost frames of the town because it's really hard when you visit either in picture or in person these places to think about how big these towns actually were before things just disappeared. And so thank you all for joining tonight. We're going to hop right into it. If you don't know, Utah has a national treasure. And not just your area down there in Moab and Bears Ears and the San Rafael Swell. We have other national treasures. And this one that I'm going to talk about today is the Transcontinental Railroad. So in April of 1869, as the railroad construction moved eastward from Sacramento, it entered what is now western Utah. From the east, we have the Union Pacific Railroad building from Omaha, Nebraska into Utah from the east. And they met there at that upper right part of the screen, the Golden Spike National Historical Park, which is managed by the National Park Service. Well, by 1900, the railroad did not like this section of map that I'm showing you, from the Nevada border on the left side of the map to what is now Brigham City and Corinne on the right side of the map. It had multiple passes, which was hard for steam train travel. It was long, and it went through areas that just didn't have as much economic driving force as if they went straight across the Great Salt Lake. And in 1900 is when the Southern Pacific Railroad, who actually took over operations from the Central Pacific, they laid out the plan to cross the Great Salt Lake. And this is what we know now as the Lucin Cutoff or Great Salt Lake Cutoff. And it goes there in the very bottom left of the screen, all the way straight across the lake and into Ogden, Utah. That was finished in 1904, which meant this northern branch, this red line that crosses your screen, became less and less important to the railroad's service. It wasn't discontinued automatically in 1904 because there was an interest in the ranching, the sheep herding, the sugar beets that kind of are the dominant products of this area. So they kept this rail line open. But by World War II, the traffic was down to one train a week in some places, and it just was not worth the railroad's investment Plus, with the effort in World War II of the United States, this was seen as an unnecessary contribution. So in 1943, this whole line from the west side of your screen all the way around the north arm of Great Salt Lake and all the way to Corinne was discontinued. The rail was ripped up, melted down for munitions, or reused in the Ogden Defense Depot as rail. And then the actual railroad ties, those wooden things that the rails lay on, those were pulled off. And then this railroad bed became a highway. It became a county road for the next 40 years or so, until eventually pieces, when the railroad got this land to build the construction from the General Land Office or the United States government, it was meant to be used as a railroad. Once it discontinued being a railroad, it was supposed to slowly convert back to public domain, public ownership. This was completed in the late 1980s. And so now, if you're a Utah resident or you're a visitor, you have 87 miles of intact original transcontinental railroad alignment. And it's now a driving backcountry byway. You know, there's no rail, there's no cross ties there anymore, but there is the ability to drive 87 miles of this original alignment and see some really amazing places. And to an archaeologist or a history nerd, this landscape is just awe-inspiring. When you go out there, you really feel like you can put yourself back in 1869. And it's public land. You go out there year round. I've gone out there in January, and it's a really fun place to just go get lost for a while. And it's managed by our friends at the Bureau of Land Management. So, go back to that map real quick. So the place I'm going to talk to you about is that big red circle called Terrace. Terrace was the major railroad town west of Corinne. So Corinne's on the very east side of this map. Terrace was the next big town, and then the next big town would probably be in Elko, Nevada at this point. And it was big for the reasons I'm going to discuss. But to give you a flavor of what this landscape looks like, this is a photo taken by one of my volunteers this year of one of the trestles that still you can see out there. You can't drive across this one. Sorry, looks a little sketchy to be driving on. But this is just such a spectacular landscape. And even with beautiful photography, you know, you can really feel that history. This trestle, which a trestle is just a wooden bridge that crosses a gully. And so wood trestles were very common on these transcontinental railroad alignments, but we have other features out there. We have stone culverts that go underneath the railroad grade to allow water that were constructed in April of 1869, and they still function to flow water today. And that's pretty amazing and tells you the level of effort that went into this railroad's construction. So let's talk more in depth about Terrace. So after the railroad was completed, May 10th, 1869, you know, the first freight traffic coming across that line didn't come for several more months. And the railroad said, oh, great, we finished. We constructed this massive feat of engineering, of labor, tens of thousands of laborers, whether they're Chinese, they were Irish, African Americans, even Native Americans participated in the construction in parts of Utah, LDS graders, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now we have a railroad. Now we need to maintain it. Now we need to make money on it. And one of the big factors when you look at a railroad's development is to make sure that we have places for maintenance of the actual trains themselves. Steam engines are notoriously hard to keep up. There's lots of moving parts. They're firing coal or wood. And so those items, those impacts, you know, need to be constantly maintained and taken care of and cleaned and fixed and repaired and shined. Terrace was identified as a location. This was just wide open, nothing in 1869. But the railroad figured the mileage between Elko, Nevada and Corinne and then Ogden and said, this is a very decent spot to build a maintenance hub. And so we know by fall of 1869, the town of Terrace started to slowly be constructed. This is one of the few historic photos we have of Terrace. We only have about 5 historic photos of a town that was upwards of 500 to 600 people at its peak. Some reports said all the way up to 800, which if you put yourself in 1870s Box Elder County, Utah, that was a major community, especially on this end of the town or this end of the county. And so you can see in this photo, the large train depot. It was a two-story depot where the trains would unload and load passengers. You see the main street there, the ornamental trees were planted, and then the big trains, the big train tracks. This also was very interestingly the third largest Chinese population in Utah in the 1870 census. The first being Ogden, second being Corinne, and then the third being Terrace. This speaks to the importance of Terrace to the Chinese population. So all along that red line I showed you, about every 8 to 10 miles would have been a small maintenance station where you would have had 10 to 15 laborers that their responsibility would have been to make sure that the tracks were good after each train, make sure the ballast was settled, make sure the rail didn't need to be replaced, or the ties didn't need to be replaced, clear debris after floods. And so you spaced all these workers 8 to 10 miles. That station would have had a water tank and a foreman's house. So in 1870 and 1880, every single maintenance crew in Utah was Chinese. 12 to 15 Chinese men, averaging 14 to 25 years old, spaced in these 8 to 10 miles areas with 2 Irish foremen. It was very much 10 to 15 Chinese folks, 2 Irish guys. There was some variation as we got closer to bigger towns, but that was your cultural experience in this landscape with nothing in between. Train would roll by and you'd see faces from China and faces from Ireland. And so towns like Terrace functioned as a commercial center for these maintenance places, a place where those workers could come into town and be with larger populations of Chinese. And it was also a great place to mingle, share stories, eat some food, and perhaps even have a store or restaurant. So Terrace really did function as a large Chinese hub in the 1870s, 1880s, probably all the way up to about 1900 to 1905 when Terrace really tanked after the construction of the Lucerne Cutoff. So businesses in Terrace, we had 2 large hotels. We had one ran by the railroad itself that a lot of workers, itinerant workers would have stayed in. And then up to 5 saloons would have been in there. And these stores would have had anywhere from bakeries to meat markets, dry goods stores. And from the archaeology, we're actually starting to see a little bit of perhaps a Chinese business on Main Street. And this really does highlight the bustling nature of this town. So it was a maintenance hub, but then in the 1870s, there was some silver mines that were struck up in the mountains of Grouse Creek, which are the mountains in the background of this painting. That brought another wave of immigration. And so for really 30 years, Terrace was a place. It was a place that people knew. There was Democratic and Republican rallies in Terrace. There was a marching band, schools. They had a garden. And all of this really played into Terrace as a bustling place. The problem, water. Water was needed for steam trains, and it was needed for people. Terrace was about 13 miles from the closest clean water source. And so the railroad actually constructed in 1869 a 13-mile buried pipeline built from redwood logs that had been hollowed out by hand boring them, and then they would have been nested together, buried underground, and constructed 13 miles. This is a map from 1871 showing that pipeline coming in from the north and coming into the town of Terrace. Water was critical. Water will continue to be critical. And we've talked about extreme drought in Utah. Well, water is a factor to a lot of places and a lot of life in Utah's history. And Terrace was no different. It was built with redwood pipes and then upgraded later to cast iron pipes. But think about relying on that aqueduct, because if that aqueduct cut off, there ain't no water coming for you for a while. And trains really needed clean water to run operation, and then people, and then of course beautification. We showed those trees, planted trees and pleasure gardens in the middle of the desert, all being funneled by this construction. This is a blueprint that came out of Stanford University. So Leland Stanford, of the Central Pacific Railroad, they got a lot of the resources put into their library because of Stanford's role in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. This was the idea of Terrace. All these beautiful streets, nice lots being laid out. You can see that center area that looks like almost like a fan That was the maintenance shops and the roundhouse for the railroad. Very well organized, very well laid out. That's the ideal. The real is a slightly less factor. That there was a hope that this place would be a permanent. There was a hope this would be an Ogden or a Brigham City or a Corinne, but it never boomed that big. Even 500 people, that's a big town. But there was never that city planning, that development structure to make it a permanent sort of grid layout as we normally would see in Utah. And once this town was abandoned, so 1904, the loose end cutoff's constructed. Even before that, in the 1890s, the maintenance shop was removed from Terrace because the railroad knew they were going to be shutting down that line. 1901 was a massive fire that swept through Main Street, which is Main Street is sort of the north side of this map, so the upside of the map. You see those pits; those are all building foundations. Swept through downtown, burned most of that. After 1904, the maintenance crews were even moved out of Terrace into other locations. And what remained of Terrace was either picked up by ranchers and moved, railroad sold buildings, or it just slowly disappeared back into the desert. So I'd like to just share with you a little modern view of Terrace. This is a drone we have here at State History, just showing you that landscape. So those cars in the very center of the screen, that's kind of on the railroad grade. That would have been right in front of that historic photo with the big train depot. And so it kind of gives you a scale of this landscape. Where you see these folks walking in the foreground, you'll see sort of divots in the earth. You'll see these discolorations and grass and then sort of almost sand dunes around it. That's Chinatown. Chinatown was on the outskirts of Terrace. It was behind the industrial works. It was on the opposite side from the white side of town. This is not an uncommon pattern when you look at 19th century and early 20th century United States. Spatial segregation by race and ethnicity. Now, there was no laws in Terrace that said you had to live in a certain pound, but there was an expectation. This is sweeping over and you see those sort of fan shape. Those would have been the roundhouse bays where the steam engines would have been pulled in and maintained. And then that pit on the left of the screen is where the turntable, that giant lazy Susan that would have spun steam trains around. But I love to give a little bit of an aerial view to just give you an idea that this landscape is pretty bleak. But like me, I'm an archaeologist, so I don't like people. So going out here is really great. You don't run into people that often. But the first time that I visited this site with the Bureau of Land Management in 2015, I was shook because this was one of the most impressive archaeological sites I have ever seen. Because of the nature of its abandonment, it didn't even go through the pains of a mining town that boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust, where stuff got destroyed, dug over, rebuilt, because it boomed and then busted permanent. The archaeological legacy here is deeply impressive. When you walk across this landscape, you are just covered in history, artifacts everywhere. There was no trash disposal, so trash is just on the ground. And sadly, that archaeological legacy has been impacted. You know, one of the bigger things we noticed when we were there is the amount of illegal excavation, what we consider paw hunting or looting in archaeology, and then just plain old vandalism. So this is the interpretive sign for Terrace that has been shot so many times, actually been shot more times since this photo was taken, almost making it unreadable. You see the piles of artifacts at the base of the sign. There's something, and you guys have a lot of this down in your neck of the woods when you visit Native American sites. People like to pile sherds or pile artifacts. It's like, oh, look what I found, or make them available for the next visitor. Well, this is a really awful thing to do in an archaeological site. I know you guys know that. Is I always relate it to a book, a great, great history book. If you want to pass this book down to your kids and you think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and you rip and you give it, but someone rips all the pages out or half the pages, throws them away. Then they take another quarter of the pages and pull them out and put them back into the book in random order. And then you give that book to your kid. The book is not sharing the same information as it did once before. We've lost stories, or the story has become unintelligible. In this analogy, ripping the pages out of a book is looting. It is digging for artifacts for fun or profit. That rips those artifacts out of their context, and it destroys our ability to use those and interpret those. And moving artifacts on the surface of a site are moving pages in that book. Yeah, they're still there, but you don't know where they were near. You didn't know what came before and after. And so that's why archaeologists have such a visceral reaction when they see this looting behavior. Now, this site, hadn't been in federal protection up until the 1980s. Even 1979 was the first real law protecting archaeological sites with real hardcore penalties. So a lot of the digging had occurred out here in the 1960s and 70s when bottle hunting was a really popular activity, even when it wasn't even illegal. But now it is, and we're trying to actively reshape the behavior, because I went out there and found active metal detector holes right through the site, and someone stole the BLM sign saying, "Please don't steal," which ironically funny, but also speaks to the bigger issue of people respecting this place. So this is the site that I walked into in 2015. The beautiful thing that happened is we led up to the 150th anniversary of the driving of the Golden Spike in 2019. I was involved at the state level with our partners, with the state of Utah, the governor's office, and the Spike 150 committee, which formed around trying to highlight this event for all Utahns. So as part of that, I did some tours out on the railroad grade and did caravans of vehicles showing them important places in partnership with the BLM. And I became friends, I would like to say, with the Chinese community. And they came on the very first tour. And they were blown away when I could walk them to Chinatown, pick up off the surface a piece of Chinese imported porcelain and say, "This was a railroad worker's house, and here is what he ate out of." It was a very visceral reaction to the families and the descendants. And at this point, the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendant Association had formed, and they were just awestruck with this site because they had gone to Golden Spike for many years to celebrate on May 10th, but never really had that broader picture of all those Chinese workers that had lived and died along this railroad grade for 40 years after the train, the big celebration on May 10th. And so the Railroad Workers Association, which is President Karen Kwan, who's a state representative here in Utah. She's the first Chinese American state representative in the state of Utah. She's the president of this organization. Her late brother, Mike Kwan, he passed last year very suddenly. He was the president before her. He was the first Chinese American judge in the state of Utah. And she's also a professor at Salt Lake Community College. And then Margaret Yee, she's the chairperson of the association, and she's an entrepreneur. If you've been to downtown Salt Lake City and you ate at the Jade Cafe, which is the vertical diner, she's co-owned that location for 55 years. And she is actively trying to promote Chinese heritage, Asian heritage in the state of Utah. And we intersect on the railroad, but these two do so much good for all Utahns and our Asian community here. And so their passion really led us through the rest of what I'm going to talk about tonight. Is I walked them onto this site and I said, "See the vandalism, see the looting, here's all this cool history." And Karen looked at me and was like, "What are we going to do about it?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "We need to save our history. It's walking away every single day. And my ancestor doesn't show up in the history books. I don't have his diaries. I don't have photos. This thing that you're holding is his heritage. It's his legacy. And every time somebody comes out here and walks away with it, I'm losing part of my identity, my descendant community connection." And to an archaeologist, that's the motivator, is to find ways to do what the descendant community wants us to do with the artifact legacy. And so we started thinking, how do we protect the site? How do we work with the federal government to protect the site? And then how do we investigate it and start uncovering these stories? And I don't need to go into ad nauseum about how the Chinese have been systematically excluded from historical documents of the 19th century. Census records were very poor. Most didn't even track real names. Photos didn't go into Chinatown. Diaries or newspaper articles were usually, if they did mention the Chinese, were extremely racist and extremely biased. And most of these guys lived here, maybe went home, maybe went to larger Chinatowns, but did not leave much of a written history for us to uncover. And that's the real powerful place that archaeology can come in, is even in historical archaeology, the common person's life, the immigrant life, the child's life, the woman's life, those are not typically described in historical documents. And so archaeology can really be a powerful tool. And so in that initial conversation, I agreed, let's do more tours. And so we were able to actually, this was an amazing feat. This is a 3-hour drive from downtown Salt Lake, and then on a dirt road, and then 30 miles on a dirt road. And we got 110 Chinese descendants and members of the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendant Association to tour these locations. And Terrace was one big stop, but just to see what their ancestors had helped construct was a very powerful moment. And what was really amazing for me is the difference in groups that I took out there. When it was all a European American or a white group, their relation to this stuff was different. They're like, oh, this is so pretty. I just want to take it home. The Chinese community, this was much different of a relationship. Like, I don't even want to touch it without permission. This is my ancestors' heritage. Why would people even want to steal this? And I think that's the real powerful lesson. You know, as an archaeologist, I have an ethical code that we don't take artifacts. We shouldn't loot artifacts in general. And it's oftentimes from a very scientific position. But to the descendant community, whether they're Native American or Chinese, there is a different connection to these objects than I have as white middle-class boy from Michigan. And so this really helped me able to translate proper visiting and an ethical respect of these places, seeing it through the eyes of the descendant community. And it did open some eyes, and some folks that went on these tours are like, oh yeah, I bobble hunted here in the 60s. I feel bad now that I took this heritage away from folks. Those are powerful moments. And so these tours were really great to kick us off. So in 2020, we did our first excavation out there. And then in 2021, we did our second. So now the second half of this presentation is more about what we did, how we did it. So this is all in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management. So yes, this is a state-federal partnership with a private entity as the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendant Association, the ideal dream of doing good public outreach and excavation. So in September 20, we were in COVID, and so we did an excavation out there en masse, all that fun stuff. And it was the first formal excavation of a Chinese or railroad town site in Utah history, the first scientific endeavor. That's pretty spectacular. And we used volunteers through a program called Passport in Time, which was started by the National Forest Service back in the early 90s. And now the BLM, as another federal entity, can play in that pool. So we were able to get volunteers from a nationwide application process, Oregon, California, Nevada, and Utah, plus staff from both our office and the Bureau of Land Management. We did 1 week, camped out there. First people to live in Paris really for a week in probably almost 110 years. And then in May, we went back right around the May 10th period and did a second week excavation because it was just so powerful what we had found. And everyone was so passionate, let's go keep going back. And so it was so much fun to do work. And I love using volunteers because it brings so much great energies. You pay people to do archaeology, excitement sometimes wanes. You get people that volunteer to spend a week in the desert with no electricity and no showers and pooping in a porta potty. They're there for the fun of it, right? They're there for the passion of doing the job. And so it's always really invigorating to an archaeologist to work with volunteers, and I love doing it. So our project plan, I'm not going to go into boring detail like probably most archaeologists would, but we always have a plan. We don't just go out there shooting from the hip. And so we use technology, so ground penetrating radar, which was provided at no charge to us by a consultant, Cannon Heritage Consultants out of Logan. And ground penetrating radar just is a way for us to look below the ground surface without digging. So it helped us identify some potential areas to dig and also rule out areas that we thought something was, and there wasn't. Then we did some excavations. We tested 4 different parts of town. The big one I'm going to highlight where we excavated a Chinese home from the 1870s, which was really, really exciting. We did surface collection because of the high risk of things walking away under their not own power, we did a surface selection of stuff that we thought would be high risk walk away or things that had a lot of scientific or cultural value. And we map all these down to less than a 1 millimeter accuracy. So when you hear people say archaeologists are just looters, like not with the amount of paperwork I have to do. It's like it's a little different game for us. And then the big one is we did a complete bottle survey. So we divided this whole huge site up, which was over 40 acres. This is a big site. And we started doing block surveys, identifying bottle bases and bottle finishes, because those can give us really great indicators of use and time period. Not going to bore you with statistics, but this is what all that hard work does. So all these bottle fragments, we leave at place, but we record them, we map them, and then we had some really skilled volunteers that know bottles really well. And they're able to identify what they are, their age, maker's marks are always, of course, really important. And it's giving us information for the first time. Is looking at Main Street, where all the businesses were, alcohol seems to be a pretty dominant thing for folks drinking out there. And this could be liquor, this could be imported ale and whiskeys, wine, champagne, pretty much everything. That Cooper and Wood in the upper right, that's a Scottish bottle. That's coming out of Scotland. And it came all the way on the railroad. This actually is an 1860s kind of bottle, all the way up to more beer bottle type stuff that you would expect. On the bottom right is a shoe fly flask. So this is what you would fill up with whiskey. It looks like a little flask that you would put in your pocket. But then you can see all the other range of stuff that we were able to identify. Medicinal uses, soda. Soda was very popular. The Emmett Brewing or Emmett Bottling Company of Ogden was almost every single soda bottle we found on site. And that tells us something about they had a very strong relationship to some of the retailers there. And then food and down the line. So the bottle survey is starting to give us some information. But this is the exciting is after we did GPR and we wanted ground penetrating radar, we wanted to identify an area in Chinatown where we could try to start understanding the layout of the town, because there's no real maps of Chinatown. There's no photos of Chinatown. There's not a lot of information, not even really verbal descriptions. So how do we uncover what this community looked like? And so we walked and we found some upright timbers that were coming out of the dunes. And these are sand dunes because there's such little vegetation that the sand blows, and it actually covered Chinatown in almost 3 feet worth of sand, which I'll show you in some of the later photos. And so using those upright posts, we were able to lay out some excavations. So this is one unit kind of going through the layers. See the upright posts on the left. And as we dropped in, you can see the sand, but then it starts getting more charcoaly, those black flecks. And then boom, the excitement, the high fives, the floorboards. So we, in the first excavation last year in 2020, we dropped these units and hit an intact floorboard from a Chinese house built probably in 1870. That's pretty stellar and pretty awesome. And that finding is actually what really led us to go back and do more open excavations of this landscape, because like, okay, we have an intact deposit. There's a picture of me standing in it at the end of that September field project. You see that back wall, all these vertical posts, that would have been the outside of the house. And then those floorboards that I'm standing on, I'm inside the house. That's pretty exciting. With all the things that have occurred to that site, we can interpret what a Chinese home would have looked like. Archaeology is not what the Discovery Channel or History Channel shows you. It is slow, it is painstaking, some might even say boring, because everything we do is paperwork. Every level we excavate, which is usually a 10-centimeter level, each one of those had its own paperwork, descriptions, and artifact logs, and photos. Each bucket of soil that was removed to fill or to empty those units, they went through that screen. That's another volunteer screening the artifacts. And then on the right is when we hit those intact floorboards or intact deposits, we dial the slowness back even further. And we get in there with bamboo skewers to clean the boards, to expose them very carefully, because archaeology is destructive. We destroyed this site for all intents and purposes, right, by excavating it. And so we take time and painstaking care to do all this. And each of these folks that you see in the photos, these are all some of our volunteers. And Sue and Elaine, they're from Idaho, Mountain Home. Rachel in the middle, she's from California. And then Beth on the right, she's from California. So volunteers doing the work themselves. This is the finished product in May of this year. We were able to open up that whole house. And that's one of my colleagues, Elizabeth, doing a 3D scan of it, which I'm going to show you just in a second. But to give you a visual, there's the house's extent. And then that's the basic dimensions of that house. It was small. It was Spartan. This was a working man's house. There might have been 3 to 4, 6 guys living in this house of Chinese descent with a stove, bunk beds, and life. And so it was really fun to see this come to light. The sad thing in this is you see right at my colleague's foot, see this sort of circular cut that's into the floorboards. This is a looter's hole that was dug in probably the 1960s or 70s looking for bottles. And so they had went through the interior of the house all the way through the floorboard looking for shiny things. That was a little disappointing for us, but the artifacts that we found inside were still pretty amazing. So I wanted to show you very quickly, we used a portable 3D scanner, which is for iPad. Those of you that get like the new iPad that just came out this year, it has built-in 3D modeling software. And so you can just use your iPad, go walk around, and it takes a bunch of photos and actually creates a 3D model. So this is a 3D model of that excavated house. So you can see our nice walls. So proud of the volunteers. If you've ever had an archaeologist talk to you, they're always proud of their sidewalls. My volunteers do great sidewalls, making everything nice and clean. But what was really neat is right in the corner, you can see this little wood structure right here. That was a small wooden box that house's occupant had in the corner of that room. And it might have been where they just kept their personal effects. And I did that when I walked some folks through, and the Chinese community are like, "You sure it's not a Buddhist shrine? All our houses have Buddhist shrines in them." I'm like, yep, there's the archaeological bias. I'm not of the cultural group, so my mind didn't think of that as a possibility. That's where that relationship with the descendant community is, I think, so important. But yeah, this is a very cool way to make sure that we interpret as much of this site as possible, is to use 3D scanning technology. So, oh, there's the door, or what we suspect to be. We also had friends. We had a couple scorpions. We had a couple large, angry-looking spiders. It's always good to hear those screams when people are 3 feet down in a hole. So what did we find? What did we learn? We found an amazing amount of cultural material, tens or thousands of artifacts that we're still working to get processed and cleaned. And we're actually probably going to do another volunteer project this winter as a lab project to get these things processed. But that little round guy right in the center, that's a marble, like a child's marble. Soy pot, so the spouted jar that would have been used to import Chinese soy sauce or vegetable oil, jean rivet, tin can fragments. All of these things, while very seemingly boring, they all tell us an important story about the person that lived inside. And so I wanted to highlight just a few artifacts today. This is what we call a wintergreen bowl. So wintergreen speaks to this nice sort of greenish robin's egg blue glaze. It's a celadon glaze. This would have been manufactured in China, imported, and then sold for Chinese consumption in North America. So this was an export good meant for Chinese consumption. You don't see this really showing up in non-Chinese assemblages. And that mark, we're still trying to get good interpretation on it. It is a mark of that pottery shop. And this is a fairly rare find, because a lot of pottery marks on Chinese ceramics at this period don't have good points of reference of what they're meaning. On the right is a Chinese coin, brass coin that we found called Wen. This is probably one of the earliest historic artifacts in the state of Utah. This was probably minted in the 1600s or 1700s. Why did it show up in a railroad town in the 1870s? It wasn't for money. A lot of these coins were brought over by Chinese immigrants as good luck charms. A lot of times Chinese homes would have a whole string of these in red ribbon and red string inside their home as a good luck charm, as a way to keep bad spirits away. So it's a little bit of folklore. And sometimes, personal talisman or a necklace, sometimes even used in Chinese medicine. A lot of these were used for rubbing on people's sore spots as a means of herbal medicine or homeopathic medicine. Food. Who doesn't love food? But the environment out here, much like your guys is down in Southeast Utah, is dry. And that allows us to have excellent preservation of artifacts. On the left, this is a fluted liquor jar that was again imported from China. Would have had liquors in it, medicinal liquors, whether it's rice wine, plum wine, or sort of a medicinal liquor. But then the other food, we found intact peanut shells. And these are not from the looters. These are 19th century peanut shells that we're able to find. We found a coconut husk. That's that bigger chunk there on the bottom. Jujubes or Chinese dates. These would have been packed probably in stoneware jars imported from China, dried or pickled. Melons. So that looks like a watermelon seed because it's a melon. It's again a food. So this is telling us a little bit of the diet. One of the great stories that came out of the transcontinental construction is, oh, look, the Chinese had better diet because they ate a well-rounded diet and they didn't drink water out of the creeks. They drank boiled water. Well, why that was important is the Irish and other workers were drinking water out of springs and getting tons of dysentery and illness and giardia. And they also were eating boiled beef and alcohol as the rest of their diet. The Chinese had a much more robust and well-rounded diet. So they have less sick days. So the railroads are like, we love these guys because they don't have sick days. And so you can see this represented on the ground. And so as we identify all these artifacts, we're starting to learn about the diet. Was it very Cantonese or was it more Mandarin diet? We can learn this from those individual little pieces. This is my all-time favorite. If you've ever met an archaeologist, you probably always ask, like, what's the coolest thing you ever found? Most times you'll see an archaeologist like, that question again, because we don't think of them in that way. We think of all these things as very important and all telling a story. This find was something that I felt was extremely important because it was able to connect past and present and to give personality and humanity to the people of the past. This is a piece of a hand-carved Chinese inkstone. And if you've ever seen traditional Chinese or Japanese calligraphy, you'd have this solid square block of ink, a little bit of water, rubbing it back and forth on that slate stone surface to make a liquid ink. And then you could do calligraphy with it and writing. This is important because a lot of the 19th century depictions of Chinese were illiterate. No, this person was writing. And then what were they writing? We don't have records of the letters that these folks lived in. Even the United States, we have very few letters of the Chinese going home. These guys left China, maybe at 18, 20 years old, living in middle of nowhere, Utah, surrounded by a population and a government who hated their very existence and tried to either legislate them out or even have acts of violence. This connection to home is so important. And having this artifact found in this house, it makes you think, what were they saying? What were they talking about to their loved ones? Were they saying everything's fine? Were they saying, hey, here's some money? Because most of the Chinese men that came to the United States in this period were sending money home to support families. Were they talking about politics? Were they talking about us, the white Americans that were around them? Which most Chinese considered us barbarians, by the way, because we didn't bathe, we didn't brush our teeth in this period. So all the images we were putting on the Chinese were like, yeah, these guys are dirty and stinky. Letters home to wives, loved ones, parents. They got news of their family dying back in China. What were they saying home? This little artifact makes that connection, I feel, so much more real. It makes that connection so much more personal than some peanut shells. Like, what was the person thinking as they were writing this letter home? And I think it's a powerful artifact. So on the Friday of that second excavation, we had a public day. We had Lieutenant Governor of the state of Utah came out. That was pretty spectacular. You don't know much about her. She's a history nut. Loves history, and to get a lieutenant governor onto an archaeological site in action is a very powerful moment for us to bridge that gap between policymakers and the artifacts on the ground. And so we felt it was a good opportunity to have this hands-on experience. I also want to give a shout out to Senator Scott Sandel, who's the state senator that covers this area. And then, of course, Representative Karen Kwan, who's a member of the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendant Association, but also a great advocate. And it was just great fun. It was tons of fun. The Chinese community came out with everything. And so before we did the backfilling, so all archaeological sites, if you do it right, when you're done, you fill them back in. And so you preserve what's still remaining for the next generation and try to make sure that you protect it as best you can. Before we did that, the Chinese community led us in the honor of the ancestors. And this was just an offering to those who came before, to thank them and to honor that their lives have meaning both today and in the past. And so the Chinese descendant community, about 15, came out from Salt Lake City and the east front or the west front of the Wasatch, brought more food than probably 300 people could have ate. And we ate like kings that day, but also very meaningful moment, giving back to those that we had just investigated. And that's a powerful part, like archaeology being able to tell this story, but also make the current community, have that point of respect and pride of their own history. And this was at the time that we saw in early 2021 with this increase in anti-Asian violence. And so it was a really good moment to talk about this great partnership, state and federal, public-private, Asian community, non-Asian community. I thought it was a very powerful moment. Subsequent to our excavation, we've done some site protection. We were able to work with the BLM and get a fence out because people started now driving across the site, continuing to damage. And so now we've been able to at least, get a protective fence to stop some of the off-road traffic, but also to keep people from wandering and picking up objects and putting them back at the interpretive signs. This is one phase of an effort to increase the site protection. But as you all well know, the BLM has one law enforcement person for this, 2 million acre field office. So enforcement's hard. So what we really need to invest in is protective measures and increase signage. The next step is we're trying to raise money to put more interpretive signs out, including some messaging of why you shouldn't move things, why you shouldn't loot, more of an emotional plea for folks to do these places with respect. Because I think some people honestly do visit and don't know the right etiquette. So yeah, what's next? We're going to do a bunch of lab work, lots and lots of lab work. The old adage is for every day in the field, we spend 4 in the lab. With new technology and new tools, I'd say it's probably a 1 to 8. Every day we dig is going to be 8 days in the office. And so that's a great winter project for us and a great diversion for me from my normal job duties. And that's why we're going to bring in volunteers to help. We're going to do a lot of writing to get that in. We're going to do more interpretive signage and fencing. And we're also working with a canine forensic team that specializes in archaeological burials to find areas of Chinese burials on the landscape out there. We have 0 documented Chinese burials along the transcontinental. We know that they were buried. We know they died. Some were sent home, some didn't. So how can we make sure to protect these places? And burials are very hard to find. So canines forensics teams are really important. In Terrace, the Chinese were not allowed to be buried in the Terrace cemetery. They generally weren't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground anywhere in the United States or Canada. But after our big event in May, I had a random member of the public whose great granddad owned the meat market in Terrace, sent me a note and was like, I have a bunch of family history. Would you want it? I'm like, yes, absolutely. And he had an oral history from his grandfather, who was raised in Terrace as a small child, talking about going to a Chinese funeral. And he gave enough of a description. So now we have a starting point of where maybe the Chinese part of the community's burial ground was. So we're hoping to get the canine crew out and do more work. But again, raise money to do all these things. None of this is cheap. And so always got to do a shout out. I get to do all the talking. They did all the digging. I had an amazing crew, volunteers and staff. And without them, none of this could be possible. And you just look at those faces and like, that's a crew that had fun. that's a crew that smells real bad and needs a shower. So I just want to end with an acknowledgement to everybody. I'm not going to read this, but so many people participated to make this a success, and I'm just here taking a little bit of the glory for it. But all these people bent over backwards to make the success, and so hopefully you all enjoyed that and you have some questions for me. But I'm Finney.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible overview of a tremendous project. I've got a couple audience questions to
Please.
jump in. Someone on Facebook is inquiring, writing and saying, we loved the exhibit about the Transcontinental Railroad and Chinese laborers that was at the museum this summer. What was your involvement with that exhibit that's traveling around the state?
Great question. So we conspired. So one of our sister divisions, Arts and Museums, they create traveling exhibits on different art topics all the time. And so as part of this build up to the 2019 celebration 150th anniversary, we pitched to them like, hey, let's do a traveling exhibit on the Chinese story. And there was a little bit of money floating around from the Spike 150 Commission. So I provided a lot of the historical information, the objects that were included, the physical objects. Those are from Terrace and some other sites along the railroad grade. And so, yeah, it was a truly collaborative effort with us, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Division of Arts and Museums. So, yeah, I nerded out and helped that, and went to the people that know how to do good traveling exhibits, and it's spectacular.
Wonderful. Yeah, it generated a lot of excellent conversation at the museum. And that's part of why we're so happy to be offering this follow-up conversation about that. So thank you for your involvement with that. Someone else wrote in saying, I am in awe of the food artifacts. Is that a surprise? That's a surprise to me. Is that something that we could find elsewhere?
Absolutely. The drier the environment, the better preservation. And what was amazing that day that we had the VIPs, we left one little unit unexcavated, did a couple of shovels, found a peanut shell, and it was like 3 inches below the ground surface. And so, yes, in San Juan County and Grand County, finding organic materials is always pretty common. Corn or beans or stuff is very common. But the wetter you get, the less likely it is to find really good intact food waste stuff. So the dryness up here was a benefit to us. But yeah, archaeologists can find that a lot.
Let's see. Another one was someone was inquiring about railroad workers on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad near Moab. A number of folks tuning in tonight are based in our community here and are wondering if you could speak briefly to that story.
Absolutely. As much effort as we've put into learning about the Transcontinental, less effort has been put into the builders of the Denver and Rio Grande. So I do know that in the 1880-1881 construction of the Denver and Rio Grande narrow gauge, it was Chinese labor that pushed west out of Grand Junction and built the alignment all the way into Price and then all the way up into Spanish Fort. There are some limited archaeological remains of the Chinese workers on that landscape, but because of the unique history, most of it's been fairly well destroyed by modern railroad expansion. When new railroads expand their rails and new facilities, a lot of these older sites kind of get erased. We were lucky on the Transcontinental that so many reverted back to public ownership. I was out near you guys a few months ago, and we went and documented a Japanese railroad workers burial out near Thompson. And because Japanese replaced a lot of Chinese labor after the 1890s, we find a lot of Japanese sites in your neck of the woods too. But again, the maintenance crews in the 1880s would have been a lot of Chinese guys, but less time depth because it was about a decade and a half after the Transcontinental's initial completion. So you see a lot more Italians and then Greeks in your neck of the woods more around 1900 and after.
Interesting. 2 questions from Mike on Zoom, who is wondering, first, where are all of these artifacts going to go once you are done with them?
Excellent question. That was one of the hiccups that we had. Utah is the only state that does not have a repository for historic period archaeological collections. No museum will take them in the state. So we'll just build a new museum, and the state is doing that. The state of Utah is actually sponsoring the Museum of Utah. It's going to replace a building up on the Utah Capitol grounds. And I was able to secure that we will be a repository for these historic period archaeological collections that don't have a home. And so it will meet federal standards. And so we will be able to curate these in a museum for long term, use them for teaching, and also work with the Chinese community to make an exhibit. So when this new museum opens, 2024 is the current plan, these artifacts and these stories are going to be in that museum. And so it's a pretty amazing opportunity. But we would also be very excited to work with a Moab Museum or other museum partners to do miniature museum exhibits using these artifacts and stories as well. Because as an archaeologist, a lot of this stuff goes into a warehouse never to be seen again, like the Ark of the Covenant, Indiana Jones reference for you. But to get these things out and enjoyable, I think is really an important part so people can learn these stories, and seeing the thing is so cool.
Thanks for that. Another question from Mike, who says, do you want to mention the recent book published on this topic?
Feels like Mike might be a plant in the crowd. So yes, I was able to work with amazing professionals. Big shout out to Mike Pope, who's a retired, semi-retired archaeologist in Utah, but he just is steeped in all thing railroad. And so he helped us write a new monograph with myself, another archaeologist, Mike Sheehan, and then Ken Cannon consultants. And so we created a 300-page volume, which is really designed for a 21st century tour of the railroad from the Nevada border all the way to Ogden, with stories about each of the stations along the route, pages about archaeology and ethics. It's a Bureau of Land Management publication, so it's free. It's available online for free for download. We have a limited set of hard copies, but if someone was really, really deeply passionate about getting a hard copy, we could make that happen. But yeah, it was a labor of love. It was a great quarantine project. It kept me busy last year.
Wow.
And into this year.
I'd say excellent. That concludes the questions that we've gotten from our audience. Thank you for all of those excellent questions across both platforms. If there are any other that show up on Facebook in the next couple of days, I'll be happy to address those there. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us this evening. That was a really exciting dive into what you do and a really valued supplement to our exhibit this past summer. So we are very appreciative of your time. A thank you also to the museum members whose support empowers programming like this. We appreciate you. We look forward to in-person events one day soon. And in the meantime, thank you for joining us on the Zoom universe for this exciting conversation. As a reminder, this conversation can be found afterwards on Facebook. And thank you, Dr. Merritt. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you so much. And thanks, everybody, for the great questions.
Good night, everyone.